Where do you fall on the lines of pro hipster, or do they annoy you, or are you okay with them?
uh, Man, I don't know. I guess I don't have too much of an opinion. It's like living in Portland, and when I moved down to LA, I lived in Silver Lake, so it
Okay.
was it was it was all part of the scene.
Yeah. So you're in Oregon, and so at what point did you realize that you'd had an affinity toward architecture? Was it something early on that you had learned, or?
Yeah, I do think it happened pretty early on,
Hmm.
and some of it was just kind of, I guess, like a very typical, like, I love Legos, right? I love drawing. I had, I think math was always something that came very easy to me. So all of those things kind of aligned, and I remember, even when I was younger, just drawing up my dream house, right? Which always, had these ridiculous elements like basketball courts and
I was gonna say, can you describe it? What was in your dream house as a kid? Basketball courts, and what
Uh,
else?
man, that I can't really remember many of the other elements, like programmatic elements, but I know that was in there. I'm sure it had a big indoor swimming pool and probably a movie theater, and who knows what else.
So you were planning to live
But
the life, right?
It sounds pretty
oh, yeah, oh
reasonable.
yes, oh yes, oh yes. Um, but I think one of the things that had a big impact on me growing up was my grandpa had kind of built our family home,
Hmm.
and he, he passed away before I don't have any memories of him. So I think I was one, but I think that house and just kind of like the idea that, you know, he thought of it and built it and created it always kind of stuck with me. And it was kind of in a way, a connection to this grandpa I never knew.
Hmm.
Um, but, outside of that, I think it was also tough because definitely Gresham did not have any, great architectural landmarks to
Oh,
be inspired by. And even Portland, I think that at that point there was not too much. So I didn't really know what architecture was, right? I knew I liked houses, I knew I liked buildings, but I still don't. I think at that age you
sure.
don't really know what you're getting into.
Yeah, yeah. I think the assumption most people have, as I did probably at the ages that you're describing, is you understand architecture is associated with buildings. You understand that architects, in my view at that point, they draw buildings. So they draw doors,
Mhm.
windows, and bathrooms, which is true. But
Yeah,
of course,
yeah,
once you get to school, it's like, oh my God, there's a whole like wormhole into another, universe of ideas behind what this profession's and study is about. I'm curious to know the house that your grandfather had done. I mean, was it was it one of these houses that's kind of eclectic and built over time, or was it like what was it like?
he was more a builder.
Okay.
So he came over. He immigrated from Sweden, uh,
Mm.
and that was kind of a trade that he knew. So he built several kind of homes in the southeast area, like our my dad's house, the house next door, which was for kind of family, I guess relatives that also had moved over to Portland.
Oh, cool.
And so they were they weren't too, I don't know, it wasn't anything too unique or extravagant. It was just kind of a very kind of practical, rational approach, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, when I drive around, I could kind of spot them. It's
Really?
like, okay, there's little tweaks that he kind of used in his buildings.
Okay, so he knew what he was doing. It wasn't one
Yeah.
of these cases where a client or a homeowner is just kind of like, I'm going to build my own house and ends up being. But actually, a lot of times they're quite fascinating, but they're also horrible. you know,
Yeah,
it's like,
yeah.
oh, wow,
That's
that's cute and
interesting.
different. So then you you had an interest in houses, you had an interest in building to some degree, and et cetera, et cetera. But obviously, whenever I was in high school, everyone prepares for applying to colleges and choosing schools and all that stuff. Did you go directly from high school to college?
Yeah, yes. And I did have a little bit more exposure in that I started working for like a drafting office. I think I was 16, maybe that. I feel like that was probably when I started just working during the summers. And that was, all completely old school, all hand drawing, T-square, real blueprint machine.
Wow.
But again, it was like very typical buildings, right? Apartment buildings in Portland. And it was more just about the drawing aspect. And then I knew that I kind of wanted to go into architecture, but I didn't know exactly where. So I went to USC has a summer program, like a 3-week intro course.
Oh, you did the summer program?
Yeah.
No kidding.
Yeah, so
I did the same thing.
All right.
Yeah. I'd gone the summer after my junior year in high school is when I went.
That's same.
Yeah. When everyone's preparing for like, what are you going to do for the rest of your life kind of thing.
I know.
Yeah.
So I don't know what you thought. I thought it was great. And all of a sudden you're kind of just like exposed to another level of architecture, especially like the tours and going around, but also just like the actual design projects that you were doing. For me, it was, a step up.
Yeah.
And that's where I actually got I think the best kind of advice that I had, where I didn't know what I was doing in terms of looking for architecture schools. And also everybody that I was talking to had no idea what they, had no idea about architecture schools. So I felt like that was the first place where I got to talk to some people that had some really good advice about what programs I should be looking at. And that's kind of where Cal Poly came up.
Yeah, sure. And I remember the summer program, and I know for myself, the program's exercises and projects you did were very much like first year things. So fairly abstract. There was one that was less abstract. It was like a meditative space, something vague like that. And so it had to do with like real space, but it was still, very, very conceptual and abstract. And I think for me, I just kind of fell in love with the process of it and the cardboard and the late nights and the camaraderie. Probably more that than thinking about, like eventually I'm going to do buildings. I don't think that even occurred to me despite going to architecture, honestly.
Yeah, I do remember the 3 projects that we did. We had the chair out of cardboard, kind of the Frank Gehry inspired chair project. We had, I want to say it was a small gallery space, and I believe the project site was in Venice, at this little infill lot, and then a house for a musician. And I feel like maybe we got to choose our client. I think I chose the musician. And the only thing I really remember was it was this like pentagon shaped room.
Those are pretty hard projects. We had very easy ones. It was, my memory is kind of hazy, but the first was like an abstract, 2D work, and then you kind of make that into a 3D cubic model out of cardboard, but it's fully abstract. It has nothing to do with anything really. And then a meditative space. But I think if they assigned me like, okay, come up with a house for a musician in a week or whatever it was, I don't know what I would have done.
Well, I can't claim that it was good. But...
So that's when you first kind of do a trial run or a test run of architecture school in a way. You learn about Cal Poly. Cal Poly is obviously a good school. What was it like being at Cal Poly and studying architecture at that time?
Cal Poly was perfect for me, just as I think not only in terms of architecture, but as like a college, a town, a place. I think that all kind of like worked out really well, just in my growth. Architecture, it may have been similar. Like I think the experience of a studio life was really great. We kind of had a somewhat tight knit group of friends, right? That just created a great atmosphere. And I think I always tell people, it's Cal Poly. I think all schools are kind of like this. You can go through there and get an amazing education, and you can also go through there and probably not get that great of an education, right? Mm-hmm. It's it's really dependent upon you and the kind of like path that you choose and which professors you want to take.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that's even more the case with a school like Cal Poly, because it's large. I don't know how big like the years were when you were there, but like my graduating class was over 200 students. And so there's a lot of different literal paths and teachers you can choose to take, and everyone has a reputation within the school, right? So you know which ones are going to be easy.
Yeah.
And you can more or less, depending on you know the how does it work, like you how early on you are in the queue to choose a teacher. You can choose easy ones all the way through if you wanted.
Yeah, you could. But you know, I don't know. I always have this problem because, you know, now I'm at the point where other people they're asking you like, oh, what school should I be looking at? Where should I go to school? And I think my knee-jerk reaction is always, you know, if you're really interested in architecture and you want to study architecture, you should go to a big city, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go to LA, go to New York, go to Chicago, go someplace where not only you have kind of great buildings and examples of architecture that you could go see, but also professors that are practicing, right, and working. And I think that makes a huge difference. But you know, there's this whole other side of it, which is just you know, kind of what you're prepared for in your personal growth,
right?
More as a person than an architect. But
that's a really good point. And I was actually just about to ask you, because you had mentioned that for you felt the University of Cal Poly and the town and everything that it has to kind of offer in its city was a good fit for you. But I was going to ask you basically what you just said, which was, well, a lot of people would argue that it's potentially a negative because you're kind of in the middle of nowhere. There's a really downtown's like, you know, 200 feet long or whatever, and therefore you're not surrounded by architecture, and one would assume that you should be if you're going to be studying it.
Yeah. No, I had friends from LA at school, and you know, I feel like their kind of reaction to it was a bit different.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It was kind of more like, oh man, what am I doing? I should get back to LA. But for me, I have such a affinity for the Central Coast, so I think that, you know, just like the natural landscape up there is kind of had as much of an effect on me as more so than the architecture up there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
sure.
We talk about that often because David went to Cal Poly and I studied in Paris, so talk about big city, right? And as much as it was great to have all the museums and see all of the new construction and all of that stuff, I remember the first year I moved to Paris and I was not even 18. I was overwhelmed. I was coming from, you know, like the countryside, the small town, and I'm in this big place. I know nobody and it's really intense. And I think you're right. It's really about like your personality, what you know maybe you can handle, if you can handle some place that's maybe a little bit challenging, or if you want something that's a bit more comfortable where you can maybe play a little bit harder in your study instead of being distracted and, you know, trying to grow up in a place that's not familiar, which is not for everyone.
Yeah. And I think that was it for me, right? I knew I wanted to get away, but I think it was also probably a safe enough distance from Portland that it didn't feel too far.
Yeah.
You know, and I didn't know anybody else at the school, so you're just kind of going in solo.
But then after that, though, that being said, you decided to go and study in Copenhagen.
Well, that was, you studied abroad, right?
So what happened? Yeah. You got tired of slow?
That was just the fourth year. You know, I mean, I think Cal Poly offers a few places that you can go study abroad.
Mm-hmm.
And the main ones were Italy and Copenhagen.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, for me, I think also just like my whole family background is Scandinavian and Swedish. So that felt like a natural landing spot. And, you know, that was, that was an amazing experience. So I think not only being just like absorbed in Danish culture for a year, but also the amount of kind of traveling that we got to do and architectural tours that were available. It was a great experience. And I think that also, you know, something that definitely shaped my my approach to architecture.
So I'm curious to hear more about that, and why or how things were different when you got to Copenhagen. Like what aspects of the city and the culture and that stuff, yes, but the mentality to architecture, their approach to architecture, how is it different from what you were exposed to, I guess, from years 1 to 3 at Cal Poly?
I graduated from Cal Poly in 2003.
Mm-hmm.
So when I went there, I think that definitely kind of the dominant mindset was, deconstructivism. And, I think it was very much about form. It was form heavy and what we were doing, right? It was all physical modeling. And I think going to Denmark, and especially kind of Scandinavia, and even a lot of other parts of Europe for that matter, I think the projects that I kind of latched onto had a different, sensibility, whether it was more of a material sensibility, kind of a simplicity in the approach. And I also find myself just kind of like, even looking back on some of the things that we went and saw that maybe that didn't hit me at the time, but that now I'm looking back on and saying, oh yeah, that was amazing. But it's like, well, we got to see a lot of Arne Jacobsen buildings, Alvar Aalto. I think the cemetery by Gunnar Asplund that we saw had a huge impact on me. And that was more kind of like this combination of landscape and architecture, which I've always been fascinated with. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do think it kind of comes from a more kind of like material sensibility to architecture.
Interesting. Was program a huge thing at that point? My architectural history and my timelines are all mixed up, but yeah, I mean, let's see. I mean, a lot of I don't remember the years, but I felt like a lot of the office from that area were very, very program heavy at some point with the kind of morphing boxes and, things like this.
And is that kind of like the, I guess younger versions of Big and JDS?
Yeah, sort of like MBRDV, things like this.
Yeah. And that, like, I think I did latch on to that too. And maybe that's had less of an impact for me because, for the past 15 years, I've been working mostly on houses. So it's less of programmatic shifting. But
so you managed to get through Cal Poly, and I remember they used to tell students in the first day of first year, like, look to your left, look to your right. Only one of you is going to end up graduating from the program because a lot of people wash out. And I don't know if they said the same thing to you, but you made it through.
I did. I have one good Cal Poly story for you guys. Which there was a professor when I was there, Bill Donnell, and he taught second year. It was all hand drawing, so it was just mostly like sketch paper, and all of the projects were just hand drawing. So that was kind of the rules of the studio. And I remember the first project that we did was an entry to the architecture building at Cal Poly.
Building 5?
Redesigning this.
The concrete one.
Yes, the concrete one.
Oh my God.
And so it was a crit that just will always stay in my memory. And I remember him, what he had said was it, Scott, you're so unoriginal that you copied everything about the existing building and didn't do anything, didn't provide anything new, right? And he's like, you were so stupid that you copied everything bad about the building and none of the good parts of the building. He's like, and your entrance is so bad that you had to put a sign in front just so people knew that it was the entrance. And it's a shitty sign.
Oh my God.
So I like that just to say, like, look, you need a thick skin in architecture. And, that was like, that was part. It was a little bit part of his approach in the education, but I love the studio.
That's so funny.
So,
At least he was thorough. He was very thorough in his critique. That's actually a really good project, though. I'm surprised that I never came across that when I was in school there. I mean, because it's a very odd build. People should look it up. Building 5, Cal Poly's architecture building. It's this very weird brutalist thing. People love it. People hate it. But as far as making an entry, it's difficult because it's such a porous. It's a building that like straddles an interior breezeway, so there's not really like a front door to the building.
Yeah.
That's a good assignment.
And it's still like that sticks with me every time we're doing something where it's like a remodel to something where you're trying to respect what's there. It's like, yeah, okay, don't copy the shitty parts of the building.
That's a really good one, though. Thick skin. I think it's interesting. I mean, I suppose if the teacher, is like that and they're like that with everybody and they're not like singling someone out, it's more acceptable. It's a form of feedback. I think it gets weird though when teachers start to really rail into students. I remember also during second year, actually, we had a presentation, maybe it was a midterm, I don't know, something. Everyone's pinned up and this guy's presenting his model and it was some kind of fairly abstract house, right, that we're all supposed to be doing. And he was just getting asked really difficult questions from all the critics from all angles, from left, right, up and down. And he was having a real tough time responding. And I remember thinking like, he's getting tough questions. Like no one else was asked these questions. I'm not sure what's happening. And so he was like, so what you're telling me is I should do this. And he held over the model over a trash can. And the teacher pauses and she tilts her head and she goes, yeah, and he threw in the trash can, and that was the end of the critique.
Oh my goodness!
And to this day, I don't really know what that was about. It seemed very odd, but it happened.
That's a bit much.
And then he left the studio and smoked some weed.
Yeah. I feel like at that point, right? It's just like you see that where during crits, it's like people just double down, right?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, student's going to double down on it, and the professor's going to double down. You're like, all right.
That's a good way of putting it. It does happen, yeah. And everyone just keeps going. It's okay. Let's see where this goes until it blows up.
Yeah, I think that the tough ones were always right. The professor walking over and then like ripping apart your model and go. It's kind of like, oh well, did you think about doing this? Right? you're like, come on.
Yeah. Did that ever happen to you, where they would actually come over and tear things apart or flip it upside down or whatever?
Definitely to flip it upside down. And I had models ripped apart. Yeah. And I think it was more of a show, just like, look, this isn't a precious object. You're here to learn.
Yeah.
That's what this is about.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember we had something like that where we made models and we swapped models in the class, and then the next person would like do something to it, but it wasn't for, that wasn't a separate exercise. That was your study model for like the quarter-long project. And I did this model, and I was always really kind of overly obsessed with making sure the models were clean. I gave it to this guy who's a friend of mine, and he shredded the thing. Like it came back, it was like a quarter of the weight. There's rips and tears, and I was like, oh my God, I didn't even get to take a picture of this. I don't remember what it was. And he's like, yeah. And you could tell I think he started doing what he was doing, and I think at some point he wasn't confident in it, so he just kept going. I'm like, there's nothing left. He's like, yeah, I think it got away from me. I'm like, I think so. I guess there's no more house, man. Like,
it's a funny form of collaboration, right? It's like, okay, here, you take this over for a bit. Let's see what happens.
It could be interesting, but also potentially very dangerous.
Yeah.
So Cal Poly, and then what's interesting is you end up doing a master's in architecture, but did you practice after graduating from SLO before that?
Yes. So I worked for 3 years. I moved down to LA, and I would say I was lucky in that, I happened to kind of chase a girl who happened to live in one of the best cities to practice architecture. So got to do both. And looking back on it, it was funny. I had two there were kind of two job offers that I had in LA in very different offices. And one was one of my friends was working at, and they had not, they were not doing incredibly interesting work. And it kind of would have been, higher paying, I'm sure, better hours, all of these things. And at the time, I didn't really know the decision I was making, but looking back, I went to work for this firm, AGPS Architecture. It was run by Mark Angelo and Sarah Graham, and they had just won the competition to do the Portland aerial tram in Portland. Mm. So it was kind of like this great opportunity for me to go and work on this project in Portland. And I kind of always say that in a way that's where my architectural education started, not to really discredit everything that happened before then, but it changed the trajectory of where I was headed and what I wanted to do. I think they operated the office very much like a studio. They both taught, they were both professors. So, the office was kind of a continuation of that. And everybody else that I worked with, had already kind of graduated from a prestigious architecture master's program and had many more years of experience than me. Mm-hmm. So I just had these kind of several great mentors, great environment. And I just look back on how different things could have ended up if I would have gone the other direction. Right. It would have been totally different. So
what were some
for
of
me,
the,
that was the turning point.
Yeah. What were some of the things that made it a turning point or made it so different? One of the assumptions that people have, or one of the biggest differences between school and practicing is obviously technical knowledge. But I get the sense that there was perhaps that, but also other aspects about architecture that made it significant for you in terms of the education of it,
Yeah, I would say it was all the parts actually that weren't the technical knowledge,
huh.
Which that came with it, right? That was part of it, but the emphasis was still, it was very much a design-oriented office, right? With open critiques and arguments about each design that was presented. And that, I think it was also just maybe the seriousness that everybody kind of approached architecture with at that office.
How big was the office?
When I first started, we were probably only 5. And then, when I left year 3, I think we were probably 10 or 12.
Uh-huh.
Oh, wow.
So small office, but doing some larger work. So we had the aerial tram. They won a competition for the Children's Museum in Los Angeles, which was, that built out in Hanson Dam.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm not sure what it is now, but.
So what is it like being in an office when a small boutique-sized office is very design-oriented, they land a competition of that size of the Portland aerial tram or this other one that you're describing? What is it like to be in a space like that?
Their firm is a little bit interesting in that they also have a Swiss connection. So they had an office in Switzerland that was much larger with a few other partners running that. Mark Angelo kind of straddled both LA and Zurich back and forth. And Sarah was in LA 100% of the time. So they were used to dealing with larger projects. And I think, just in terms of being an employee at that, what it really meant is you're kind of just given a lot of responsibility, right? At a very, at least a very early age in my career, right? So I had the people above me to really mentor me, but I was expected to produce. And, I always kind of say at a small office, right? I felt like after 3 years, I probably walked away with 5 years of experience. And that was kind of the benefit.
That's actually really cool because that's for sure one of the common assumed benefits of being at a small office is more responsibility, exposure, packing 5 years into 3 years, this kind of thing. But oftentimes it is also assumed that if you're at a small office, that means you're doing smaller sized projects. Whereas in this case, like the projects you're describing, they're big buildings, and
Yeah.
that's kind of, I don't know if it's super unique, but it's definitely, it's different from working at a small residential office where they do standard single family houses. It's a different thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And even, I mean, comparing that to XTEN right now,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's, I mean, we do some large houses, but most of our work is still residential.
So you are at AGPS, and was it right after that, those 3 years, you end up going to UCLA, right?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And what was it's funny because we actually get a lot of people asking, excuse me, whether or not they should do an MArch, specifically an MArch 2, I think is the question. Because you already
Yeah.
had a BArch, a Bachelor of Architecture. So you had 5 years, assuming it took only 5 years. You were good in a certain sense, right? You have the degree, you have the experience. You can probably just take the exams at that point, be licensed, and be done with it. Not spend more money on school or whatever else. So I think a lot of folks are kind of in the same position, and they're wondering, like, is it worthwhile for me to go to a master's? It's like, why did you go and get a master's?
I mean, I think I really went because after being in that office, I realized that it was, a step in my education that I was missing, and that I needed, to continue to do what I wanted to do. So I felt like I still needed that growth. So that's why I went back. I know I didn't need it for licensure or anything like that, but yeah, I was excited to go back to school. And it's funny because I would almost, I guess my experience with it, I feel like it's very different than undergrad, and maybe that's because I put a 3-year gap in between.
Mm-hmm.
So, it was also very different for me because my undergrad experience was largely still hand drawing and physical modeling, right? And when I went to UCLA, it was all digital and Rhino and rendering. So
right.
That was kind of a big change, and something that really helped me. I also would have said that I would have gone back longer, I think, if I had the choice, right? I feel like a 1-year program where you're trying to cram your master's into, what's effectively like 9 months, is too short in a way.
It's very quick. So,
and you're kind of like coming in with people who've already been there for 2 years. So.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Wait, what do you mean by that? Because an MArch 2 is typically 1 year, right? Because you already have the 5-year at that point. And so you come in, but other folks have been there for a couple of years already, or?
So the way that it used to be set up, and I guess I don't think it is set up this way, but the MArch 1 program we would be in the same studios, right? With kind of the 3rd year MArch 1 students.
Gotcha.
Would be in the same as MArch 2 students.
Oh, okay. The MArch, okay, right. I see. And I always get confused. And the MArch 1 is the program that lasts like 2 or 3 years, 3 years, I think. I see.
It's 3 years. And then at that time you could, if you would apply to see if you'd get kind of like the first year, I don't even know what they called it, waived, right? So you'd come in at advanced placement status.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, you come in and there's students already there. I think it's interesting that the motivation to get a master's was really sounds like much more of an internal and personal design feeling of where you were at the level that you were at, and it sounds like also that you'd felt going to school was the way to gain that knowledge and experience. Maybe is it because mainly in school you're left on your own and you're not, underneath an employer, and also you're not having to deal with necessarily all the realities of budgets and clients and et cetera, that the school space was necessary for that kind of development?
Yeah. And I think it is two different things, right? When it's really kind of like just you and your design, is different than me kind of like, let's just say, fitting in at an office and kind of carrying through with their design vision, right? I think it's two very different challenges. And I think, often, of course, as students, right, you're brought into an office and you're mainly asked to fit in, right, to whatever office you're working at. And so, I think I needed the challenge.
Was there any kind of focus, because UCLA's program or school is titled Architecture and Urban Design, was there any focus on the urban scale with what you did, or is it strictly architecture?
It was a little bit of, well, I actually, when I was first looking at graduate programs, I was considering going into a landscape program. And that was mostly because I was really interested in a lot of the landscape urbanism that was happening at the time. I still knew that I wanted architecture as the focus, but, the landscape urbanism part was something that I was really drawn to.
Yeah.
And part of that was even, I think with the Portland Aerial Tram, that was a larger project, but it covered a really long, it was like 3 separate project sites. Each had these landscape components. And ultimately, I think I decided on UCLA just because there were kind of a few professors whose work I saw where they were kind of involved in this landscape urbanism. Now that, like, the landscape part really isn't, a heavy part of UCLA, right? Which I found out later. But, even a lot of my studio projects, I think, had that aspect to them. So it was kind of architecture focused, but with a little bit broader. Right. And it definitely kind of the urbanistic approach, where I would say half of my projects there.
Right. And it's also interesting that you end up going to school and the scope, let's say, ends up getting a little bit broader in the way you're describing. But tell us the journey from there to working at XTEN and now, leading XTEN with the co-founder.
So after I graduated from UCLA, I think my goal really was I wanted to work for a smaller office again, just because I loved the amount of experience that I was getting. And I had talked to other friends maybe who were at larger offices, and you could kind of see a little difference there. And I also really wanted to work on a house, right? Something quick that I would be able to see completed and built. And at the time, I think for me, that's what separated XTEN when I started, was like they had some very interesting projects that were pushing the boundaries, and they were getting them built, which I think was, it's just a difficult thing to do. So, my first, and I also had a slight connection with one of the former employees, right? Had known the principals at XTEN. So It was kind of a natural progression in a way. But my original plan was like, okay, I'll come work at XTEN, stay there for 2 or 3 years, and then jump out and start my own thing. And, I think that's also what many people, go to school think. And it's a difficult thing. So after 2 to 3 years, I definitely realized I wasn't ready to do that yet. And, I think the kind of design fit with XTEN and the working relationships was a great fit, right? So that worked out really well. And, I think my first project I worked on was one of the first ones was the Naka House, right? Which kind of landed on the cover of Arc Records. So it was just like a great experience from the get-go.
Was there ever a point where you thought, I'm going to try and break out and do my own thing? So it sounds like you started at XTEN pretty much right after grad school, right? And you've been there obviously since. But did you ever revisit in those years and thinking, maybe I will take a crack at branching off completely on my own? I
did think about that. I think I've never really been that interested actually of going out on my own. I think a partnership was always more attractive to me. And maybe that's also just like a way of working, right? I think it's always, I kind of operate better when I have somebody else to bounce ideas off of and work with collaboratively, which I've found out over the years. And, XTEN, I think really it was, founded by Austin and Monica, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'd worked with them very closely for, up until 2015. And, Austin kind of passed away
mm-hmm.
pretty suddenly with an aggressive form of cancer. And, that's when Monica asked me to kind of join her in running the office. So it's been 7 years now, but yeah, I think we'd already developed a working relationship that kind of fit pretty naturally. So it was an easy transition and an extremely difficult transition at the same time, right? The kind of design part was easy, right? We were just continuing to do what we had been doing.
Right. And how large was the office, so we have some kind of context at that point in time?
We had gotten up to, we were around 22 or 23, I think.
Oh, that's pretty good. That's pretty sizable. Yeah.
So several projects and several projects under construction. So it was, it was a learning, more learn on the go experience, kind of throw you into the deep end.
So prior to that transition, and obviously there's the very real and emotional component of someone passing away, but what was your title? What was your level of responsibility in terms of managerial responsibilities before that transition? So
my response, I was an associate, kind of right below Monica and Austin, and that office had kind of ebbed and flowed just in terms of the amount of people when I started, right? Just going through the recession in 2008, and so we kind of shrunk and grew to the different levels, but I was always kind of right below Monica and Austin. And at that point, I think my main responsibility was kind of running the office, right? I think there was a lot of work and design work for Austin and Monica, and I was kind of coordinating the teams. And that was kind of my main responsibility. So when I kind of switched over to, being principal with Monica, I think there was, part that it was a natural transition because my role was already to kind of manage the office.
Gotcha.
Right. So that part was easy. Monica and I were used to kind of designing, and really it's kind of like me, Monica and Austin, right? They would kind of just be at kind of the start of it, right? And then, I'd be more involved with the development of it and the 3D representation of the project.
Gotcha.
And I think Monica's always been a little bit more kind of front end, right? In organizational aspects of the project.
So what were some of the new things that you had to take on once you became principal? Because it's, maybe it's to some folks, it's like, well, if you're managing the office in the day to day, that's already what else is there left? More to do,
Yeah, right. That's simple.
I'm just posing the question. I mean, I know.
Yeah, I think the thing that I wasn't really involved in, right, was the clients, right, and managing the client side of it. So that was a real learning curve for me. And, I think there was also a part where it's I knew how to kind of fit in and work kind of in that pre-existing condition, right? But Monica and I still had to kind of navigate how we would be working together, right? And, that changes a little bit. My approach changes, whether I'm kind of running the office or I'm kind of a principal helping lead the office.
Gotcha. So some of the new things were relationships with clients, I guess, because typically it's the head people, the people at the top are the ones that were responsible for going and finding clients and getting clients and doing that kind of hustle if that's necessary, unless you just get a bunch of referrals. So was that
Yeah.
also something that was like a new responsibility of that side of the client relationships?
Yes. Yeah. So going out and just kind of like getting new work, meeting with new clients. And you know, I think that also the other part of that is just like the financial aspects of the office that, you know, I wasn't really involved in that level.
Right.
But that's it.
So
Yeah.
did you guys end up, once you became principal, was there someone else that had helped you take over your previous scope of responsibility of managing the office, or was this just purely on top of what you were doing?
No, I found help very quickly. So, you know, we had several people in the office that were very experienced, right? So it was kind of like we promoted 3 people up to associate level, and they kind of each had their own handful of projects that they were managing, right? And the people under them. So then I just took more of an overview of all of the projects.
Talking a bit more about what you guys do. So you do mostly residential, but not only, right? And you also have a branch in Switzerland?
Yes and no. So Monica's father is an architect in Switzerland, right? And he has an office there. And so we've kind of collaborated with that office and had different employees that have worked there, right, on different competitions that we've done, different projects that we've been working on. You know, there's a project in that office that I think has been in the works for, you know, I would say almost as long as I've been in the office. So like 15 years, and they're still waiting for final approvals.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, much longer process in Europe. But let's see, I think I forgot about the first part of that question.
Yeah, what was the first part of the question?
Oh, the different types of work that you guys do.
Right.
You focus on residential, but you do also other types of projects, right?
Yeah, we've worked on several multifamily projects. Just haven't, you know, kind of one under construction now. But a lot of the other ones kind of died out in the kind of approval and planning stages. We've worked on several competitions and, you know, some smaller stuff, you know, TI work. We're doing a kind of coffee shop in Malibu right now. So, you know, for us, it's not about, you know, just focusing on residential. You know, we would, as long as the projects are interesting, we're, you know, would love to take them on. But I think that's definitely the area where we're, you know, it's just become an area of expertise, right?
From the time you joined the office, was the interest in different types of projects and the openness to different types of projects always part of the office, as opposed to being, you know, heavily focused or solely focused on residential?
Yeah, I think there was always the interest, right? So we were always trying to participate in competitions, and it's kind of like, you know, you need a certain bandwidth in the office in terms of employees and projects to sustain, you know, these side projects, which, you know, are unpaid. So those would happen a little bit intermittently, but we'd fit them in when we could. And, you know, I think, the interest is still there. I still feel like it's always very difficult to break into a new project type, right? Yeah. Because everybody wants to see the one that you've done and completed. And so, you know, I think as architects, it's easy to see the transition from one project type to another. And of course, you know, if you can do one successfully, you know, most others you will be able to carry out successfully. But from a client perspective, that's a harder leap to make.
Right. So what are some of the things that I guess you guys do to help mitigate that challenge? Because it's a very good point, and it's something we've heard more and more and more on this show and just casual conversations with architects who are interested in doing different types of projects. And I feel like most, or certainly a lot of architects, when they graduate from school, they're like, yeah, I want to do their openness, you know, they're open to different things. So like, how do you tackle that issue of from the client's perspective, you know, you guys, or an office who has not done X type project type appears to be, less of an expert, or they're more nervous about that route?
Good question. I think we're still learning how to do that, right? And I think the what I find is the best example, the best approach in a way is if we're walking them through a project that's completed at a high level, right? That's the easiest influencer, right? Like, okay, well, yeah, you get, whatever this is, we can see that this was done, extremely well. And they can see that you're going to give the same kind of care to their project.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think it's also like one of the ideas that I was kicking around the other day is, experience in the particular project type is, of course, helpful. Like if I could just somehow download that experience, that'd be great. But also, all of these projects, even a house, for the houses that you guys do in particular, these are long and complicated things.
Yeah.
And so, the experience is like one part of the pie, and the rest of it is filled in with like how are people going to work through stressful situations. That's like half of it. I feel like if you don't have that capacity, and you're trying to do something new every time, pushing design, the experience will only get you so far. I mean, really.
Oh yeah, I 100% agree with that. This is still a business where we're working with and interacting with other individuals, right? And especially construction, it can be a little pressure cooker, right? And managing, I think managing the stress, but also just managing, maybe it's other people, the way that they're reacting, right, to some of the things going on. You just got to keep your eye on the prize, right? It's like you got to keep pushing forward and find the best next step.
Yeah.
So, and residential is always, it's a little funny because some of these are run almost like commercial projects, right? And the other side, there's some that are kind of like much looser, right? And it's just the subcontractor base and the dollar amount that's, the project can sustain. And I feel like in residential, you have to be comfortable working in both modes.
That's a really interesting point. And so just to kind of further specify what you're saying, you're talking about basically how the project runs and its organization and how, what's the word, like kind of regimented the process becomes for everybody involved. Whether it be commercial, meaning maybe more structured versus not.
Yeah, I mean, I personally find you just need a lot of flexibility. And maybe that's with residential specifically, but every client that we have, operates in a different way, right? In a kind of level that they're comfortable with. Every contractor that I think we work with operates a little bit differently, and so I think you're kind of constantly just fine tuning the machine in a way to approach that project in the best way, and it's not kind of a cut and dry, like, here's our method, this is what we do, and that's it. Yeah.
That's a super good point, because one would assume perhaps that for established and very successful offices that are constantly doing work like you guys, that okay, they must have it down to a science, and it must be not in terms of the designs itself, but they must have like the process down, and it's just easily more or less easily repeatable, and things have smoothened out. And I certainly had that assumption at some point about things, and I'm realizing more and more from our experience and from talking to others who are a lot older than us, like, no, that's never the case. I'm like, what are you talking about? You're like 75. It's like, no, it's always different. I'm like, oh, wow. Okay.
It is and it isn't. I think there's of course parts that we have picked up, and there's successful ways of doing things, and we're going to repeat those, right? But it is still a unique project, and every time, and I even just on the phone the other day laughing with a contractor that we're working with, and feel like it's every project, there's some, there's some little part of it, right, that kind of like absorbs a lot more information, time and energy than everything else, right? And the problem is that little thing changes on every project.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
But,
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully it's only one or two of those things and not like half a dozen black holes throughout.
yes.
Then the project really becomes like Swiss cheese. You're like, I don't know what this thing is anymore.
It's like your model you gave to your schoolmates.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
But
I mean, look, I got to say, like, it's about the project team, right?
Yeah.
The better the project team, the better the experience, all the way through.
Yeah.
And it just, you see the difference when you're working with good people, right? And that's whoever they are, right? That's contractors, consultants, employees, whatever.
Yeah, it makes a lot of
sense. It go smoothly.
It makes total sense. And I don't think that maybe clients, especially clients who have never done a building project, like it's a concept they get because it's easily understood. But I don't think they really understand. Like you could avoid so many problems now if you spend just a little more time finding the right people or using the right contractor or whatever the makeup might be,
Yeah. We're I would say as a firm, we're still very open, right, to working with, new contractors, new consultants, right? Every project kind of like there's some unique part where the client is bringing somebody different into the mix. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I think the longer that I work, the more that you realize here's my core group. This is who I want to work with. And it will just make my life much easier and reduce the amount of grays. They keep popping up.
I also really like the point you made about sort of the distinction between what it's like working the residential space versus the commercial. And these are obviously broad generalizations based on everyone's experiences. But I would agree that in their single-family residential, specifically single-family residential, there is a whole shitstorm of different ways that houses get built. And it's something that I think architects who are practicing in that space have to be aware of, that's the case. And you have to be kind of good at explaining to clients essentially like, okay, there's a million different ways, but if you're trying to get to this kind of product or to this thing, then you have to choose a process that makes sense for you. Because otherwise it's very easy for people to hear, well, so-and-so would build a house for $500 a square foot and it's like on a hillside, it's this amazing thing and it was no problems. And you're like, what? Is that, where's this information coming from?
Yeah. And it comes down to a little bit like what you're prioritizing, right? In this specific instance, right? Is it, is money the priority, right? Speed, time, or quality.
Yeah.
And, I think that's like a fine-tuned level, right? You can't say everything on the project has to be completed at the highest level. Mm-hmm. It's just like if we did that, no project would get built. You got to pick and choose your battles and your priorities. And I think that's one of the keys to doing a successful building and getting it built, right?
Talking about that, actually, you said that what first drew you to work at XTEN was the fact that they were pushing the boundaries in their design and actually getting that design built at that time in LA, right? Can you explain a little bit what happened back then with maybe more, I don't want to say experimental architecture, but more with non-traditional modern architecture and the complexity that brought, and maybe what the scene is today for you guys? Is it still very hard to get those types of houses built because of, I don't know, the city, the population,
or is it easier?
or is it much easier now that, you've basically did the groundwork?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. At the time, I can't really remember, all of the other firms that I was looking at, right? But I do think there was something where it's like within that project size that I was looking at, and, in terms of people that were doing interesting work, I think it was harder to get things built, and a lot of it wasn't getting built, right? Mm-hmm. So to me, it became very attractive to say, here's an up and coming firm that's doing great work and they're managing to get it built. Because ultimately that's the experience that I wanted. I didn't really just want to work on great projects that were going to end up, stashed in a drawer in a paper project, right? And now, I mean, I think that's gotten better just in terms of in general, right? What people are willing to build, right, and put their money into. For us as a firm, it's definitely gotten easier, right? And I think that's just based on our past experience and our past work, right? We have more trust from our clients, so that that helps. Like, it's always getting the first ones, right? That's the tricky one. That's the tricky part.
I was wondering also, you mentioned you do multifamily housing on occasion, or you've done a few projects. From not so much from a project or client acquisition perspective, but from a just design perspective and building code and the fact that it's a different building type. Like, how difficult is it to translate, let's say, ideas that are used at a single family house scale and apply them to a multifamily house structure? I mean, is that a really big leap for folks who are listening? You're like, I do single family houses, but I have interest in doing multifamily. Like, what is it like to make that jump?
I think there's two aspects to it. So one, it's a very natural jump, and that the scale that you're kind of dealing with on an interior level, right, and a residential level, right, is how people live and what they need in their space. So I think that part is like the very easy transition, right? That's our comfort zone. The part that is different is, generally all of those need to make sense, money wise at the end of the day, right? It's not necessarily a client saying, I'm okay to pour a bunch of money into this project because I want it to turn out fabulous, right? Right. It's got to make sense as a development project. And in that regard, there's very specific construction related strategies that are implemented on these projects, right? That is, I mean, I'm sure that's something that there's a bit of a learning curve on that. So, I don't think it's a stretch, right, to do those projects. I think it's totally doable. But a lot of these companies, right, they become machines, and they can crank these out pretty quickly.
Right. And those other project types, are you guys typically acting as the architect of record as well, or is there a separate one?
We're the architect of record, and that's for anything local.
Gotcha.
The only time where we haven't been is when we're working with projects overseas, right?
Right. That makes sense.
So,
that's pretty amazing then, because a lot of offices, or some amount that are design offices, right, we could say, I feel like it's become more common for them to, excise that portion of the responsibility, the stamping, let's say, the architect of record, and they just put that on someone else and say, we just do, quote, design, and client find someone else who's going to be the person of record for this, which is a huge weight off one's shoulder if you're not the architect of record. Like, they're very different things to have that role versus not. Yeah.
And we've done both. And, I don't think I would be interested in an office where we didn't have that role in some of our projects, because I think that's just kind of an important part of the project, right? Whether that's going through the detailing, right, and the execution, managing the construction process, all of that becomes a critical part to your knowledge as an architect, right?
Yeah.
The other side of it, like, we completed a project in Madrid. We were the design architects. There was a local firm that we collaborated with, and it went phenomenally, right? It's like, they just came back. It's like, okay, here's the issues that we're having. Here's how we'd approach it. We're like, yes, yeah, we completely agree.
That's good.
But it's like that was a success story because we were just working with a really good team over there, and they did a great job at executing the building, right? So at the end of it, we weren't walking through going like, oh, they messed this up. we're like, oh, great job.
Right.
But we're also still fully informed throughout the process, right? We're just meeting it. It's more meeting and reviewing than producing at that point.
Right. I was just going to say, you must have been kept heavily in the loop, and you guys are actually having sincere and real conversations to problem solve things, as opposed to,
Yes.
let me just send you, at the worst, let me just send you this kind of like rendering or this Rhino file, have at it, and then you pass it to the builder, the builder has at it, and everyone kind of just stops at their own stage.
Yeah, no, it was definitely where we're, reviewing detailed questions about, how a stone wall and ceiling meet, and what should that be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
I was also wanting to ask about the subject of construction administration, because it seems to be that maybe more often than it used to, folks think that an architect being involved during construction is just not necessary, or they can be involved but in a very, very light touch way. In other words, I'm just going to assume that the contractor is going to call the architect only kind of as needed when shit hits the fan to take care of problems. So I was wondering if in your guys' office, do you always perform CA, and what in your mind are the pros and cons of an architect performing that part of the project responsibility?
we have not always provided CA on our projects, right? We have done some projects where it's more just the design, and then they maybe through permitting, right, get it permitted, and then it gets built. I would never advocate for that approach. I don't think, it's not going to get us, the buildings that we want.
Yeah.
It's not going to get the best product. And, I think that the other side of this is almost from the contractor side, which is, the best contractors that we work with actually really want, an architect involved, right? Like we've been staring at this project for, I don't know, a year, 2 years, right? We know the ins and outs. They're coming in and expecting to have all this knowledge right away in terms of how to build it.
Yeah.
And there's questions all along the way. And, I think we both provide a level of expertise at that level. And having that interaction is critical.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, they're not trained architects, right? They're looking at it in a different way.
That, and they're not even familiar with the project as much as the person who designed it. So I can imagine if anyone tomorrow is coming and giving me a set of drawings for a house and expect me to get started and, get everything right away. You do have questions, and you do need somebody to go to ask those questions. That sounds insane otherwise.
It's like, let me sit with this 3D model for a month and kind of spin around and try to understand it
and have nightmares about it.
Well, no, it's a really good point, because there's a level of knowledge there's almost like a meta knowledge that the architect has of the thing that they've designed and created, and there's a kind of a spirit, there's a conceptual knowledge to it, right? Conceptual understanding, and that's also important, because when wherever the drawings leave off, because no drawing set's going to have every single thing. You're going to be missing stuff, right? Where the drawings end off, the architect still has a projection of what has to happen after that, because they know the trajectory of the design and the intent. And that's a really difficult thing for anybody, even an architect, to pick up a drawing set and be like, okay, I understand natively what the thing wants to be once it gets fully executed. So I agree. I also fully sympathize with some of the contractors. I don't like it when I'm brought on at the last minute and I'm told to try and learn about this 1 or 2 year experience that's embedded in the drawings.
Yeah. And the flip side of that is, I find we're always trying to pull the contractors into the project earlier, right? To start that conversation earlier, to get their kind of input earlier. And then a lot of the key decisions, right, just from a construction standpoint, right, they're bringing their level of expertise to the project, at a planning stage, which I find extremely helpful.
Yeah, definitely. I was curious about your guys' process. A lot of the houses that you design are extremely unique and definitely push the boundaries. I mean, there is like insane, like wide openings and floating things and curved walls and, so do you still work a lot in physical model? Do you do mostly like 3D work? Like how does the development of the design come about?
We're more digital than we used to be.
Yeah.
Right. We used to do more physical modeling. And what, part of me hates to say that because I still feel like when you pick up a physical model, your understanding of it is immediate.
Yeah.
Right. And it, whereas even spinning around a Rhino model, right, it's not the same interaction. And, maybe that's also because that's my comfort zone. And that's how I was, I spent my whole undergrad building models. So I'm just super familiar with them. But what I think we found as an office is it was difficult to keep up with the design process with physical models, meaning we would kind of leapfrog, what was happening in the physical model with the digital model. And by the time the physical model was really complete, we had already taken a couple more steps that, I don't know, made it obsolete in a way.
Right.
So, and I'm not sure what the correct approach is for that, but all I know is what we found is at the pace, at our pace and how we're making decisions, we're relying more and more on the digital world. And, I think our process, just in terms of the way we work, maybe talking a little bit to kind of the uniqueness of the projects is really stemming from the project site, and I think it always kind of starts for us in more of a 2D planning stage where, we're really kind of just trying to optimize the site and the design and how it fits with the site. So, in a way, we're kind of allowing the design to reveal itself, right? Just through working through, several little problems. And then it kind of becomes apparent almost, what the correct solution is, or at least for us and for our work, right? Like what's, there's like an aha moment, like, oh yeah, this is working really well. Right. As opposed to just kind of like maybe it's definitely not like we walk out onto a site and get the inspiration and the project has to be this. So it's always site driven, and we always kind of say, we want our projects to fit the site like a glove. And, I think that's what ends up making each project, unique. And I think the most successful projects are the ones that really lean into some unique aspect of the site that's giving it a different quality, experience than other projects on other sites that aren't similar.
Right. As opposed to the complete opposite, which would be I'm designing this thing in white or black space, and then I just drop it on to the site like a spaceship, and then it's cool looking, and that's my thing. Boom, done.
Yeah. I mean, one of the, you had just mentioned the curved walls, right? I mean, one of the projects we recently completed in the Palisades, I think we were, in a way, it had this curved street that kind of wrapped and changed, more than 2 stories along the site.
Whoa.
And I felt like, we're kind of playing with boxes, right? And you soon kind of find the limits of it. It was just like problematic, right? And once we really kind of leaned into the curve and accepted that, then it completely transformed the opportunities of the project, right? So then we were kind of like, put this long curved wall along the street, and we're able to create this more private courtyard, between that, kind of like slicing through the house. So that kind of just one example.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think for the lay person, I'm sure they must have heard many architects talk about the importance of site, but it's also, and the way you're describing it, I mean, I don't know, the things that you are responding to could really be anything. It could be the sun, the wind, the topography, it could be views, it could be the landscape, it could be any number of things. And it's not necessarily just a, what am I trying to say? I guess maybe for some folks, when they hear that, architects try to respond to the site, they think of it in a very pragmatic and almost utilitarian sense or functional sense. Like you're being optimal in terms of square footage and efficiency, but I get from what you're describing in your guys' work that it's not just about that. It's more conceptual or has more depth to it, right? The response.
Yeah, and the efficiency, the optimization, I guess I'm talking about is not necessarily like a square footage efficiency, right? Mm-hmm. It's in a way you're optimizing some unique characteristic, and I guess just like a term I like to think of as like design efficiency, right? And it doesn't mean, that it is efficient, right? But the design move is very efficient, right? Mm-hmm. And that you're getting a huge payoff for, maybe a smaller design move.
Right. Mm-hmm. Like the gesture is addressing, like say, multiple conflicts happening in that one area.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah.
Has a bigger impact.
An example for me, just in terms of one of our projects at Naka House, right? It was a remodel. We didn't add any square footage, and then we added 2 decks, and it completely transformed how the house was used, right? And how the house looked, right? It was, and that was just like two little insertions, right? And then it's just like wrap the house and refinish it, and had a huge impact.
Yeah. Are there other, well, let's call them design principles, for I don't know how else to call them, or things that you guys are always aware of from project to project that stay consistent, not so much in terms of like actual formal gestures, although maybe that's the case, I don't know, but in terms of issues that you're always aware of or sensitive to, in addition to the site?
I think we do. So some of the foundations of our projects are we do approach it very rationally, right? So I do think kind of like order, right, and even the flow of the spaces becomes a very key component early on, right? And that's kind of like the internal organization of the house. So as much as it is from the site, dictated from the site, right, coming in, I think it's as much dictated from the interior, right, reaching out into the site. And so that's just kind of a balance that we play. I think another thing that we're always searching for in our work is just like a clarity, right? And that I feel like that's maybe the best term that we've been able to come up with, right? Which it's not necessarily like a simplicity, which is maybe there, but it's really just like a clarity from concept, through the detailing, through your experience of each space. Mm-hmm. I think that's kind of the lens that we're looking through each decision.
And clarity meaning also like whether or not the final building expresses the core idea of the house and how that is able to carry through.
Yeah.
Are you still able to be like heavily involved with each of the projects in terms of their design, or like what is the day-to-day like for you?
Yeah, and that's I think what's interesting about the way that Monica and I, have developed our working relationship is we're both, we're kind of both involved in the design aspect, from start to finish. And that, the balance shifts a little bit depending upon the phase. But when it comes to kind of reviewing projects and the design decisions for the projects, that's kind of we're always both there, right? We're giving feedback to the team, team's carrying that out, right? Then we're reviewing it again. And so I think that part, takes kind of like, is almost like equal our time, right? And then we have other things that we're both tending to that are kind of outside of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's beneficial just because, you know, we both bring different sensibilities, you know, and at each stage of the project, right, having the other person's eyes on it, you know, is just giving kind of like a more thorough touch to everything.
Right.
You know, and it's maybe it's not the most efficiently way to do it, right? We're kind of doubling up on some things, but we found that that's the way it works best for us.
I think when you're a duo in design, I mean, I think at the end for the client, it's probably much better because they do get 4 eyes, 2 brains, 4 hands on their project versus, you know, if you were just the only one doing it in your own cave on your own desk, you know, like it's like you said, it's much more of a collaborative process. And I think being able to kind of like bounce the ball at each other until like the ball lands in the right spot is probably the ideal way to approach things.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, even like kind of early on, it's maybe something where we both have a different direction where we want to take the project, you know, and both options get studied and progressed. And, you know, then you're like, oh yeah, this one's working really well. Or, you know, we could take this one and twist it. But I think we've come better in a way at releasing, right, our personal attachment to the ideas, right? Just like, here's the idea, let's get it out there. And now, you know, it's just the office idea, right?
Right. And I suppose, do you think that kind of mentality about things comes around because you've had a certain amount of experience and done a certain number of projects? So in other words, there's less personal kind of self-imposed pressure to have your voice be more present in the work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that happens, right? Kind of like if it's, you know, your first project that you're working on and you really are, you know, you really want to assert yourself, you know, that ego part of it pulls back once your voice has already been a part of all of these other projects.
You had mentioned earlier that you guys also, you know, do competitions and other types of projects and stuff. But are there homes for you guys kind of like your bread and butter? And is that primarily how you're able to, like you said, like do competitions which don't pay anything and actually cost money to do in a sense?
Yeah. So I think that's kind of like our area of expertise. And I'd say it's our bread and butter, but in the past, we've used that as an opportunity to do competitions, right? I think whether those were open competitions or kind of more limited, invited competitions, that kind of, that's maybe where we've taken a little bit of a different stance, and that like ultimately we hope that this leads to a commission.
Yeah.
So the smaller amount of people involved, the better. But I think I also feel like it discredits the houses to say that it's our bread and butter.
Sure.
I don't know why.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I think that phrase has connotations of like you just do it for the sake of getting cash, but that's not necessarily.
Bread and butter for French people is everything. So
artisanal bread and butter.
I agree with that. I could live off of bread and butter.
Hey,
But it is interesting the kind of the relationship between the work that an office does the most, and they're known as experts within, and they get consistent projects of that type, and then how they're able to that would allow them to go and try things that maybe don't have a guaranteed high success chance of working out, or things that might take money or you might earn less money on. As a way to kind of support. They're not two different sides, but one supports the other in a certain sense. Yeah.
I think that's true, and I think that's a balance. A balance that we try to just work out in the office, right? I think going after, putting effort towards some of these that aren't like your biggest money makers are also important.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too for an office to know how to do one thing really well, but also still be interested and curious in learning to do something else as well.
Yeah,
I think to me
thing.
it says a lot about the personality of that office and what they're looking into for the future. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Is there a type of project that you would really like to do that maybe you guys haven't done yet, or one that you've already done but just you want to tackle that same project type again?
I think a personal one for me that I would love to do a winery. That would be probably like the number one. And I think that has to do a little bit just about the setting and the landscape aspect to the project. But that would probably be at the top of my list. I think, sure. A museum, sure. Yeah, why not?
Why not? So what's next for you guys? Do you have any fun things in the works that we should be keeping an eye out for?
Let's see, the ones that we've got coming up, we've been working on a project in Malibu on Point Dume, which is probably one of the best project sites I feel like that I've been to. And that one where it's also just a amazing team. So we're working with Ground Studio, with a landscape firm based up near Carmel. Monterey, and it's just been so far it's been like a great design experience, and so we're looking forward to that kind of moving forward and getting built.
Is most of your guys' work down in Southern California, or do you guys do things, like what percentage is in that region versus elsewhere?
I mean, I would say it's 80% of our work is in Southern California. We have done several international projects. So completed one in Madrid. One actually is in construction in Oman, in Muscat, Oman, right now. We're working on one in Mallorca.
And are these houses, or are they other building types that you won through competitions, or how does that happen to get a project in these places?
Yeah, they're all houses. I think the one in Oman and Madrid were similar in that, right? These images of our projects are just floating online, and there's, people find them. And a lot of times in these other areas, they it's like an owner calls us and they have fallen in love with a project, an image, and they want to see how it would work. And, I think the one it was kind of easy with Madrid, where we completed it at a successful project team. And when we had clients that we were working with locally, they wanted to do a vacation house in Mallorca. We already had our team set up, right? An example that we could execute it. So that made that much easier. But I think it is also part of, it's kind of like the export of California throughout the world, right? These, it's like these climates, it's kind of circle the globe where indoor outdoor living is, it's like you have the opportunity, and maybe what's being done locally is not embracing it as much as Californian architecture.
Yeah.
Interesting. Right.
So you might be opening a new office in Spain, I guess.
I would love that. Any excuse.
How is your Spanish so far?
I have to work on that.
One of the final questions for me was, what is your favorite building?
It's a good one. Well, I think my favorite, it might be a tie, and it's same architect, probably Salk Institute or the Kimball Art Museum.
Oh,
I think have been two that, I don't know. I guess it's like things that I had a, emotional response while visiting, and it's also something that, I think for Lucan, it was something that like I grabbed onto very early as a reference point. And then I kind of had this, I would say like at Cal Poly, right? Just like a first architect where, I find something that really caught my attention. And then, kind of later on, rediscovering him, as just like is a source that I'm always going back to.
Really? So would you say later on rediscovering, so like initially it's an undergrad and then later on when you're practicing is what you mean?
Yeah, I would say so. And I think that just like undergrad, right, there's a lot of different influences, whether it was, kind of decon or, going through graduate school, kind of OMA and HDM. And, but I think that's kind of like a little bit of an older reference point that I just still feel, I don't know, has a lot to pull from.
Yeah.
Well, I think especially in terms of the execution of his buildings, I mean, you can look at the more contemporary work of those who did deconstructivism or like OMA and whatnot, and not to discredit those in any way, but they're obviously very different from like those things that Louis Kahn was doing. And the thing that he produced was, very ordered, very rational. So I think there's some level of comprehension that can take place when you're looking at it, but it's so incredibly sophisticated too that I like the point you brought up of, you had exposure to something to Kahn in this case, and that later on you end up going back to it and looking at it again because you find out there's more there. And I think that's in general, kind of a good lesson, I suppose you could say, for younger designers to keep that in mind, because there are some things out there where you're probably naturally going to be drawn back to it, and you'll find that there's like a level of depth that you'd even see before, even though you saw it already.
And maybe there was some like importance about what you were drawn to initially, right? That has more to do with your own sensibilities. That at the time it's just kind of like, you're just first getting introduced to all of these architects. So there's a lot to learn from.
My last question would be, if you were not an architect, what would you be?
Oh, wow. What would I be if I was not an architect?
Unemployed. Wandering the streets.
Yeah.
Wondering what I should be doing.
Oh my Lord. I have not thought about this one.
Well, that's a good sign, I guess, right?
I think it's like there's several other interests, right? But I also realize that I just would fail at most of them, right? So, whether that's the music, I think it would have to have some kind of like creative conceptual aspect to it, and even writing, but that that's not my strength.
What kind of music? You mean like music performance or composing?
That'd probably be more, I wouldn't say performance, but probably more composing.
That's pretty cool. Well, there are definitely parallels between the two to a certain degree.
In many ways, yeah.
For sure. Scott, this was awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the show. We're going to have to meet up, and this was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching this video on YouTube. If you like what we're doing, then please support our show by hitting that subscribe button and liking and commenting on our videos.
You can also find us on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're mostly on Instagram. And you can reach out to the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message or leave a voicemail if you have any reaction to this recording, any questions you might have, or guest suggestion. Feel free to send it our way.
Cool. Thank you for watching, and see you next week.
Thanks. Bye-bye.